Any questions? Nobody has any questions? Yes.
What is the trend nowadays among Western Islamic scholars commenting on Hadith? Because these scholars that you mentioned, Mati, Bolzer, I don't know, Bolzer has already died, right?
Yeah, a long time ago.
Is there a new school or?
I mean, there's kind of two general schools of thought. I mean, in some ways there's a polarization, kind of like what I was saying, of opinions on Hadith, where you have something called the revisionist school. People like scholars like Patricia Crone, John Juan Grove, who say that, you know what, we really can't believe anything Muslims say. And we don't have any non-Muslim sources about the Prophet's life. And we can't trust Muslims because they make things up all the time. So really, we can't say anything for sure about the Prophet. We can't say anything for sure about the Prophet. If it comes from the Muslim sources, it's useless. The Quran, useless as a source. The Hadith, useless. Anything you know about Islamic history, useless. Because we need people who aren't Muslims to back this stuff up. And in a way, it makes sense, right? I mean, you don't go to the Democratic Party for the history of the Democratic Party. You'd say, okay, let's hear what the Democrats have to say about the history of their party, but we're also going to look for other sources. So it's sensible. It's sensible. But it's also extreme, because you also don't dismiss everything the Democratic Party says. Especially if, let's say, they tell you about the very dirty, scandalous beginning of their party. Why would they lie about that? Why would they make that up? And why would they make up the fact that they used to be pro-slavery, for example? No, I mean, there's things you can believe, even if it's from the party that you're studying, right? And the other pole would be, and in some ways they kind of realize that, gee, Hadith is actually a lot more complicated than just looking at a couple books and saying that this Hadith is made up because it seems to serve a political cause or legal cause. And then if you really want to know the truth, you have to at least be willing to put in 80% of the effort that Muslim scholars put in. And I'm telling you, I have never been more impressed with anybody in history in my life than with Muslim Hadith scholars. And I mean, when I first started studying Hadith, I was very skeptical. I thought Hadith was all made up and bogus. And the more you study it, the more you just appreciate the intense brain power of these people. I mean, they memorized thousands and thousands of books. And then they were able to recall all the versions of Hadith from these different books. And then they were able to analyze them, put them all together, and figure out where they connect, and make judgments about the authenticity of these Hadith. I mean, even nowadays with electronic databases and computers and word processing, I have a hard time following their discussions of those Hadith, let alone their original mastery that they were drawing on in their discussions. I mean, it's almost unbelievable. It's almost unbelievable. And if you didn't have the books in front of you that they wrote, I wouldn't believe it personally. So it's really easy to say that a Hadith is made up because it seems to support a certain political party. And so Hale and I were talking about this earlier, but you can say that not everything is made up just because it supports a certain party. In the end of the day, you have to figure out who made it up. Rumors and forged hadiths don't just appear out of the ether. Somebody at one point says something or misunderstands something. There has to be born somewhere. And Muslim hadith scholars really sat around, and that was their goal in a lot of ways, to figure out not only is this hadith authentic or not, but if it's not, who made it up? Who's to blame for it? And in doing that, they really took on a lot of responsibility that Western scholars have not done. And it's been kind of a mark of laziness in the Western scholarly tradition that we just say that, oh, this hadith is made up. It was made up in the 8th century. Where? Who? If it's made up in the 8th century, then how can you have all these different... You have one guy in Morocco who has this hadith, and one guy in Central Asia who has this hadith. They never met one another, ever. They're on opposite sides of the Muslim world, yet they have the exact same hadith. They had to have gotten it from a common source. You can't just say this is made up. It has to have come from somewhere. They can't each have made up the same hadith, right? So the other trend in the Western scholarship is really trying to go back and say, this whole issue is much more complicated than we originally thought it was, and maybe A lot of this stuff is a lot earlier and a lot more reliable than we thought. And so these are the two general schools of thought, I would say. Did I answer the question? Other questions? Yes.
Other Western Muslim scholars and modern Muslim scholars were focusing on Hadith, and how are they different, if at all?
Well, there's two. I mean, there's Muslim scholars of Hadith in the Muslim world who are, I mean, like any, like doctors or lawyers or anything, there's good ones and there's bad ones and there's mediocre ones, right? And the good ones are really amazing scholars. I mean, they're really sharp. But they don't have to deal with the constraints and burdens of proof that Western scholars do. If you work in the Western academic tradition, you have to follow the rules of the Western academic tradition. You can't just assume that the prophet is the prophet and that he's a good person, he's not going to make something up. Or that the companions are generally reliable and are not going to make up lies about the prophet. You can't just say, oh, we know that Ali was a great person, so we can believe that this is really from him. You have to in some ways follow the rules of people who aren't Muslim and who don't believe what you believe in order to prove any kind of argument, which is, I think, in the end healthy because it makes you very honest, at least in that capacity, and it makes you really have to question all your assumptions and go back to kind of first basic principles of proving things. So those are the truth. There are modern Muslim scholars of Hadith, mostly in the Muslim world, but the ones in the Muslim world, unfortunately, their work a lot of times wouldn't really ever get accepted in the West because, like I said, it assumes that the reader is also Muslim. In fact, it assumes that the reader is also Sunni or Shiite or whatever sect the person is writing from. So the author only plays by their own sect's rules. Whereas Western scholars of Hadith, like myself, like Harold Matsky, like other people, have to. Well, Harold Matsky's not Muslim. If you are a Muslim and you're studying Hadith, you can't just say, well, this Hadith is authentic because it's in Sahih al-Bukhari. You have to. That means nothing. You have to actually prove it that it's authentic through, established methods of historical criticism in the Western tradition. Does that answer the question?
I was kind of curious more like the Muslim scholar types who are interfaced with normal Muslims, like me and average Westerner, who have questions about Hadith.
You mean in America, or?
Yeah, like for example in America. Like, do they have a new approach to Hadith, or?
No, I think in a lot of ways it's kind of a tragedy that Muslims, when they come, in the Muslim world and also immigrant Muslims, they get very scared about their religion and they kind of build armor around it, and they don't want to question things that maybe they would be comfortable questioning were they in a position of power or in the majority. So a lot of times when you go to a Muslim scholar in Massachusetts or Boston, wherever you are, and you ask them about Hadith, they're going to assume that someone's attacking the Hadith, and they have to defend it. They have to defend it. It's always, no, how dare you question this? No, how dare you question that? Which is kind of a pity because the Hadith tradition is really the most open tradition in all of Islam. It's the most kind of iconoclastic tradition of scholarship is the Hadith tradition. And that's why movements like the Wahhabi movement, the Salafi movement, kind of come out of Hadith studies.